Can you believe that just one cold, wind-bitten afternoon could change the rest of a man's life? Picture this: a recluse, a man whose past is carved with scars, suddenly confronted by a stranger at his door barefoot, trembling, and the first words from her cracked lips are not a plea for food, not a cry for help, but "Hire me as your wife. I can bear children." Sounds like something made up, doesn't it? But friends, that is exactly how this story begins. Before we ride deeper into this tale, let me pause for just a moment. If you're listening now, hit that like button and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Are you out on a quiet ranch, sitting in your living room with a warm drink? Or maybe passing the miles on a long highway? Your support keeps stories like this alive, and I promise what follows will not waste your time. This is a story steeped in the American West, a story of loneliness, suspicion, and of a single choice no man could take lightly. His name was Ethan Cole. Once, folks in Wyoming had seen him ride the dust-choked trails, shoulders squared, sitting a horse like a pine against the wind. He had drifted from ranch to ranch, herding cattle, steady with a rifle, a man who got the work done. But war and loss stripped him bare. A wife taken by fever, comrades left on battlefields, and an old wound in his leg that stiffened every time the mountain cold swept down. At 40, Ethan was no longer a drifter chasing dreams, he was simply a man surviving. A small cabin on the edge of nowhere, a few lean cattle, a rifle on the wall. That was all. That day was like any other. Ethan stood outside, splitting wood, the wind cutting sharp from the north. His bad knee ached, telling him it was near time to stop. He stacked the last piece and turned for the door when he saw something move along the trail. A figure, slow and staggering, every step looking heavier than the last. The old instinct stirred. His hand drifted toward the rifle leaning by the door, but he didn't raise it. It was a woman. Her bare feet were raw and bruised. The cotton dress she wore was torn nearly to rags, the hem ripped high to show cuts along her shins. The neckline sagged open, not by choice but because the cloth had simply given out. Her long black hair was braided only halfway, the rest spilling loose with dust and wind. She wasn't a girl, no. The lines of endurance around her eyes spoke closer to 30 than 20, and her eyes dark. Deep carried the look of someone who had learned to suffer without breaking. She stopped at his step, lifted her gaze, breath ragged from the climb, and spoke. No hesitation, though her voice shook with cold. "Hire me as your wife. I can cook. I can clean. I beg." Ethan froze. How long had it been since he'd heard a voice plead like that? Not since the war, when broken men and women called out through the camps. His first thought was suspicion. Why here, why me? His second thought, sharper than he expected, was pity. He saw her shoulders tremble, lips nearly blue. He knew plain she would not live the night outside. The cost of letting her in. He understood it well. Folks in Cedar Bluff already whispered about him. A recluse. Strange. Keeping to himself. If word spread that he harbored an Apache woman in his cabin, the talk would turn uglier. But if he shut the door now, he'd have her death laid across his conscience. And that was something he couldn't carry. So Ethan Cole, a man who believed he had no mission left but survival, straightened and opened the door wide. His voice rasped from disuse. "Come in. Get warm. Eat." The woman hesitated, then crossed the threshold, keeping her back to the wall, eyes sweeping the room as though hunting for traps. Not the look of weakness, but of someone who had been cornered too many times before. She whispered her name in halting English. "Nayeli Greyhawk." "Ethan," he answered. The silence that followed weighed heavy, full of unspoken questions. Where had she come from? Who had cast her out? Why his door? But neither asked. Trust would have to be built slowly, if it came at all. Ethan placed a tin plate of beans and a crust of bread on the table. She ate cautiously, small bites, eyes still flicking to the door. He watched her in the firelight and remembered himself years ago, after battles, trembling though trying not to show it. She was desperate, yes, but not broken. That night, two strangers breathed under the same roof. One man who had forgotten what it was like to hear another's breath beside his own. One woman who had stood on the edge of death, choosing the last chance she had left. His loneliness, her suspicion that was the soil their story would grow from. And friends, believe me when I say that single act of opening a door set in motion a tale no one could have predicted. The next morning, when the pale light slipped through the cracks of the shutters, Ethan Cole was already awake. Years of solitude had trained him to rise before dawn. He sat at the table mending the leather strap of an old saddle, while the Apache woman still lay on the cot. She wasn't truly asleep, he knew it. Her breathing was steady, but taut, like a wild creature that never forgets the snare. When she finally stirred and sat up, the oversized shirt he had given her the night before hung loosely around her frame. For a flicker she looked uncertain, then quickly steadied herself, pulling her pride tight around her like armor. Ethan caught the look and gave a small nod, a wordless way of saying, "You're safe here. No one will touch you." He set a wooden bucket on the table, his voice low. Even, "Water at the well, if you choose. If not, leave it here. No one owes anyone." Nayeli studied him for a long moment before nodding. That was her way of testing him, and his way of laying down the rule: no debt, no bargain, no price. In the days that followed, a rhythm grew between them. Not intimate, not close, but the kind of rhythm forged when two travelers share the same shelter for a time. Ethan chopped wood in the yard, his bad legs stiff but his swing sure. Nayeli kept the fire alive, cooking what little they had: beans, cornmeal mush. When a shirt tore, he quietly set an old tin box of needles and thread on the table. She understood without words, stitching the hem with steady hands. No thanks were spoken, no explanations offered, only silence. But in that silence lived respect. Ethan noticed quickly she would not sit idle. If there was work, she did it. Sweeping the dirt floor with a bundle of twigs, washing tin plates in cold water, clearing ashes from the stove. But unlike the broken scenes he remembered from the war, women driven like beasts of burden, Nayeli worked by her own will. She wasn't bowed, and he respected that. Still, the line between them held sharp as barbed wire. He slept in his bed, she on the cot. He watched her in the corner of his eye, but never reached out. When the firelight cast her figure against the wall, he turned away. The promise he'd made at the door, no price, no claim, was a promise he kept. One evening, with the north wind clawing at the cabin walls, Ethan slid the tin box across the table. Inside lay a few coins, scraps of paper, and a list scrawled in his rough hand. Flowers near gone. Coffee too. Need nails. Lamp oil. You'll need boots and a coat. Her eyes flashed, sharp with suspicion. "I pay with work, not with myself." Ethan met her gaze, voice flat, steady. "I never asked for that. Don't mistake me." The air between them went heavy for a moment, but something shifted. Her shoulders eased, as if he had lifted a stone off her chest. Trust was a long road, but this was a step. At first light, Ethan hitched the horse to the wagon. The sky was sharp with frost, the ground glazed in white. He handed her an old wool blanket. "Wrap up. The road to Cedar Bluff is long, and the wind cuts hard." She climbed onto the bench beside him. Her ragged dress still peeked beneath the shirt he had given. Bare legs wrapped only in cloth strips. Her hands clutched the blanket tight, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Ethan recognized that look. It was the same tension he had felt before stepping into a saloon, where trouble waited. They rode in silence, Only the crunch of wheels on gravel and the rhythm of hooves filled the morning. Between them stretched an invisible line on one side, a man who had chosen to live without ties. On the other, a woman learning again how to trust. But both shared the same wagon, headed toward the same town. That meant something, whether either would say it or not. Ethan thought of Cedar Bluff. He knew what awaited them, their stares sharp as knives, whispers coiled like snakes. He glanced at her bare feet hidden under the blanket, at the mended dress, at the pride that hadn't left her eyes. Whatever the cost. He couldn't let her walk into town without boots on her feet, a coat on her back. This trip, simple as it seemed, just flour, nails, oil, and coffee, was more than an errand. It was a declaration without words. Nayeli Greyhawk was no longer just a desperate stranger sheltering in his cabin. She was beginning to take a place in the rhythm of his life. And that truth, though Ethan would never speak it aloud, brought with it both caution and a strange, unfamiliar ease. The town of Cedar Bluff came into view after a long bend where the wagon trail dipped across a dry creek and rose again. Weathered wooden roofs leaned under years of wind, and painted signs swung crooked on rusted chains. To most travelers, it was just another way station for cattle drives and freight wagons. But to Ethan Cole, Cedar Bluff meant eyes, dozens of them, sharp and restless, that never looked away. And today, he knew, they'd all be fixed on him, and on the woman riding at his side. The wagon wheels crunched over gravel as they rolled onto the main street. Conversations faltered. Men on the saloon porch lifted their heads, tobacco juice drying on their lips. A shopkeeper froze mid-motion, flour scoop dangling in her hand. Ethan kept his gaze straight ahead, jaw set hard. He had lived with whispers for years, but this time was different. This time. Nayeli Greyhawk sat beside him, wrapped in an old wool blanket, the hem of her ragged dress showing beneath his oversized shirt. She felt those stares like thorns against her skin. Her fingers clenched the edge of the blanket, eyes locked beyond the rooftops to the distant ridges. But when Ethan stepped down and quietly offered his arm to help her from the wagon, she let her elbow rest against his hand. A small thing, but not nothing. A sign of trust, fragile, new. Inside the mercantile, the air was thick with flour dust and the tang of kerosene. Ethan laid his list on the counter. 2 sacks of flour, beans, salt, nails, lamp oil. The shopkeeper's eyes flicked towards Nayeli, then back again, expression flat, behind them. 2 men by the stove muttered low. Didn't figure old Cole for company. A dry laugh followed. Ethan turned his head just enough. His eyes met theirs, cold, steady. No threats, no words, just a look that froze the smirk on their faces. They dropped back into their cups, pretending at conversation. He turned back, calm as before, but Nayeli had heard. She shivered once, then stilled when she realized he wasn't about to leave her standing alone. When the clerk brought out a plain pair of leather boots, Ethan set them on the floor. "Try 'em?" Nayeli sat down, exposing bare feet bruised purple from stone and frost. She slipped them into the boots, pulled the laces tight. They fit snug. For the first time since she had arrived at his door, a flicker of a smile crossed her face, brief, but real. Ethan saw it, and it struck him deep, like watching a fragile flame catch after near extinguishing. He wasn't finished. He chose a wool dress, gray as ash, and a heavy coat. The clerk wrapped them in brown paper and tied them with twine. Ethan handed the parcel straight to her, saying only one word, "Yours." Nayeli clutched it to her chest, eyes catching the light in a way he hadn't seen before. Relief, maybe, or the fragile beginning of belonging. Back on the street, the stares hadn't faded. A woman by the sugar barrels whispered sharply to another, both fixing their gaze on Nayeli. She pulled the blanket closer around herself but kept her chin high. Ethan helped her back onto the wagon, loaded the goods, and when he took the reins, his hand rested close to hers, close enough that if she wished, she could have held it. He didn't force it. The choice was hers. The ride back was quieter, but not the suffocating silence of morning. Something lighter hung between them. Ethan noticed the way she traced her thumb across the twine on the parcel, as though needing to feel it still in her lap. That small motion told him more than words. Something fragile had taken root. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was low and the air sharp with cold. Ethan hauled down the flour and beans while Nayeli set the lighter bundles inside. She placed the boots neatly by the hearth, ran her hand across the brown parcel, and stood still for a breath, letting herself believe it was truly hers. For the first time, her eyes no longer carried only suspicion. Guarded, still, yes, but softened by the faintest thread of safety. That night, as the oil lamp burned low, they lay in their separate beds as before, but the room didn't feel divided. The quiet was no longer hollow. It was full, filled with the sound of two people breathing, no longer strangers, but not yet companions. It was the sound of a fragile trust being born, a trust that might grow or shatter, depending on what came next. The storm came on an afternoon that had seemed harmless. The sun had already slipped behind the mountains, and the wind pushed in from the west, as if some unseen hand was dragging dark clouds toward Cedar Bluff. Ethan Cole, bent over fixing the barn door, glanced up at the blackening sky. He had lived through enough Wyoming winters to know when the air smelled of damp earth and the timber groaned in the gusts. It wouldn't be long before heaven itself came crashing down. Nayeli stood under the porch, clutching the brown paper bundle that held her new coat. Her eyes followed his every movement. The ragged dress clung and whipped around her legs in the rising wind, and just as Ethan drove the last nail home, lightning split the sky. The flash lit the yard like a blade of fire. Then the rain poured sheets of it, pounding the cabin roof, scattering ashes from the cook fire pit. Wind screamed through every seam in the boards, rattling shutters like dice in a cup. Ethan yanked his tools inside, but as he swung the back door shut, his boots slipped on the wet planks. His shoulder slammed hard into the frame, and the groan he let out was one he couldn't choke back. Nayeli's cry cut through the storm. She rushed forward. He gritted his teeth, growling, "I'm fine." But his face twisted. His hand clutching his shoulder told another story. The pain shot down his arm like fire. Nayeli stripped the chisel from his hand, set it aside, and stood firm over him. Outside, the storm raged, but inside the cabin, another tension filled the air. She pulled him onto the bench, quick hands setting water to boil, wringing out a cloth. Her movements were sure, not timid, though the lamplight flickered over her rain-damp face. "It's an old wound," he muttered, trying to brush it off. Nayeli's eyes lifted, black and steady. Pain. Old or new. Still pain. Her words were halting, but sharp enough to pierce the false bravado. When the hot cloth pressed to his shoulder, Ethan hissed, breath catching. Yet almost at once relief seeped in, the fire easing under the heat. She bound the cloth firm, her braid slipping forward, smelling faintly of wood smoke and rain. He looked up, finding her face so close. The strands of hair stuck to her cheek, her eyes fixed on the knots she tied. He meant to speak, to break the silence. But before words came, his rough hand rose and brushed along her jawline. A clumsy touch, uncertain, surprising even to himself. Nayeli stilled, but she didn't draw back. Instead, she leaned the faintest bit closer, the space between them narrowing to a breath. The rain hammered, wind shrieked, but in that cabin time seemed to stop. Their lips met slow, steady. No urgency, only the long-denied closeness of two souls starved of warmth. When they drew apart, their breaths mingled, their eyes slipping away in haste. Ethan turned his head, his voice husky. "You can stay, but not as property. No one owns you." Nayeli's gaze lifted, firelight glinting in eyes fierce with pride. "I stay. Only if I choose. Not a price." He nodded. His hand still rested over the wound, but the ache there felt lighter than the weight in his chest. That night, with the lamp snuffed low, the cabin seemed smaller, warmer. Outside, hail rattled against the roof. The wind howled like wolves. But inside, the storm had driven them closer danger, pressing strangers into uneasy closeness. Neither spoke another word. They didn't need to. That single kiss had already changed the shape of things. Ethan lay on his bed, turning to the wall, leaving space for her on the cot. But for the first time, he didn't feel hollow. He heard her breathing across the dark, felt her warmth reaching into the silence. And there, amid the fury of the storm, a fragile but precious trust had taken root, delicate, uncertain, but alive. The morning after the storm, the wind still carried its leftover bite. Puddles lined the dirt road into Cedar Bluff, the air heavy with the smell of wet earth and rotting leaves. Ethan Cole knew they couldn't wait any longer. Rumors ran faster than any horse, and a man living alone who had brought an Apache woman into his cabin was already the talk of every porch and saloon bench. If he stayed silent, if he ignored it, someone would come in the name of law and put chains on her. At the table, Ethan held his weathered hat in both hands. Across the room, Nayeli folded her few belongings into a cloth sack. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't need to. Her black eyes were steady, carrying a resolve different from the guarded silence of those first days. The building called the Justice Office wasn't much to look at sun-bleached planks, a crooked sign, dust hanging in the doorway. Inside, though, a long desk and thick ledgers gave weight to words once spoken. Behind the desk sat Judge Franklin Hale, hair gone white, eyes red-rimmed with sleeplessness, but voice still strong enough to command the little town. Ethan set his hat on the desk and spoke plain. "I need a paper. Says she stays with me, works for her keep, but she is not property." The judge's brow rose. His gaze slid toward Nayeli standing by the window, her hand gripping the strap of her sack, her eyes unflinching. Hale grunted. "Do you understand what you're asking?" "Cole, there are folks who won't care much for such fine distinctions." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I understand. But without it, sooner or later somebody will come to drag her off." A long silence. Then the judge sighed, picked up his pen, and began to write. Each stroke across the page was slow, deliberate, like carving into timber. Ethan stood rooted, his back straight as an oak. He didn't plead, he didn't beg. He stood as if his very body were the post holding up the truth he demanded be written. When the pen finally stopped, Hale looked up. "Before I put my seal on it, I want to hear from the girl herself." The room seemed to freeze. Ethan turned, gave Nayeli a small nod. This moment was hers alone. She stepped forward. Her voice trembled at first, then grew steady. Words broken but sure. "I am not kept. I stay. By my will. I work. I live, not property." Each word dropped like a stone into still water. Quiet. But rings spread outward. Judge Hale studied her long, then nodded. The stamp came down hard, the sound dry and final. For Ethan, it was like thunder closing a storm. He folded the paper, slid it into his coat. Nayeli stepped back, her hand still trembling, but her eyes lit with something fierce. For the first time, she had a standing in the eyes of the law, fragile as paper, but real. Outside. The sun broke through the after-storm clouds, shining over the muddy street. People stared, whispered. But this time, Nayeli did not hide her face. She walked straight, her shoulders back, eyes forward. Ethan strode beside her, not to shield, but as a quiet wall of strength. On the wagon ride home? Silence settled again, but a different kind. Ethan caught the way her lips pressed together, as though she were repeating her own words inside, in his chest. Something shifted, not just relief, but respect. The woman who had once stood barefoot on his step, begging for shelter, had now spoken her own truth before the law. When they reached the cabin, Nayeli laid her hand lightly over his coat where the folded paper rested. Her gaze met his, and neither needed to speak. Both knew her existence no longer hung only on his mercy. It had been sealed in ink, stamped by law and, more than that, spoken by her own steady voice. That night, the lamp burned low across Ethan's thoughtful face. He knew the world beyond their cabin walls was still dangerous, prejudice stubborn as stone. But he also knew they no longer walked in silence or in borrowed trust. Nayeli had claimed her right to choose, and when she had a voice, the fragile bond between them had roots strong enough to weather whatever storms might come. That noon, the sun stood high and bright, but the ground still held the damp weight of the storm. Ethan Cole had just finished latching the barn door when the thunder of hooves rolled up from the south. He stopped, eyes narrowing. Two riders came fast, dust boiling up behind them. Badges caught the sunlight crooked, dull metal glinting like warning steel. Ethan stepped onto the porch, one hand drifting near his hip where the old revolver rested. Nayeli, carrying a bucket of water from the well, froze mid-step. The pail tilted, spilling across the dirt. For a heartbeat, her eyes locked with his sharp, fearful. A memory of chains she thought she'd outrun. The riders swung down, boots sinking in wet earth. The taller one spoke, voice scratchy but full of practiced authority. "We've got a complaint out of Sweetwater. A freighter says he lost an Apache labor woman. Matches her description." He jerked his chin at Nayeli like she was no more than cargo. The shorter one folded his arms and smirked. "Law says we'll be taking her in. Best not stand in the way." The air turned heavy, thick enough to choke on. Ethan didn't look back at her. Slowly, steadily. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, the red seal of Judge Franklin Hale catching the light. He held it high. "She's no runaway. This is her paper. Works here. Room and board. Free to move." The short one snatched it, squinted at the lines, then tossed it back with a snort. "Maybe so. But talk in town says different. Hard to stop a rumor. Today or tomorrow. Trouble'll come again." Before Ethan could answer, Nayeli stepped forward. Her voice rang clear, sharper than ever. "I am not owned. I stay. Because I choose. I will not go." Her words struck like arrows in the still air. The riders blinked, thrown for a moment. Then the tall one sneered, "Lot of talk from a woman who don't belong." Ethan's fist tightened, jaw hard. But before the standoff broke, another sound rose from the east hoofbeats pounding closer. A lone rider came at a gallop, dust streaming. It was Jonas McGraw, the neighbor with a small spread 2 miles over. He reined in hard, dropped from the saddle, and tipped his hat. "What's all this racket?" Cole Jonas asked, voice low but firm. His eyes cut toward the two riders, narrowing. "If you think you can haul someone off on nothing but gossip, you're mistaken. Cole's been on this land longer than any of us, and I'll swear that woman's here of her own will." The shorter deputy shifted uneasily. The tall one spat into the mud, growling. "We're just doing our duty." Jonas planted his boots, hands on his hips, voice sharp as barbed wire. "Then do it somewhere else. There's nothing for you here. The moment stretched tight as a drawn bowstring. Ethan stood still, but every line of him braced for a fight. Nayeli didn't back away. She held her place at the doorframe, palm pressed firm to the post, her face lit with steady fire. Finally, after a long beat, the deputies swung back into their saddles. The tall one jerked his chin. Keep that paper handy. Next time, it might not be enough. They spurred off, dust curling in their wake. Only when the sound of hooves faded did Ethan let out the breath he'd been holding. He tucked the paper back inside his coat. Jonas clapped a hand on his shoulder, voice rough but warm. Don't fret. Cole, you're not alone. There's still folks who know right from wrong. Nayeli watched the road long after the riders vanished. Her shoulders sagged, but her eyes shone fierce. She had spoken what needed speaking, and she had not stood alone. For the first time, someone beyond Ethan had stood at her side. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridges, the three of them sat on the porch. No words passed, only silence, but a silence of release, not fear. Ethan glanced at Nayeli, and he knew another wall had fallen. Their bond, fragile yet resolute, had stood its ground against the storm of men and law, the night after the standoff with the two deputies. Ethan Cole sat alone at the rough-hewn table, the oil lamp throwing a weak glow across the room. In front of him lay a small wooden box, dust thick on its lid. He hadn't opened it in years, not since the day his first wife passed. Inside rested a plain silver ring, worn and scratched, but still whole. He turned it between his fingers, the light glinting off the battered metal. Ethan had never imagined he'd hold that ring again, let alone offer it to another woman. Yet the memory of Nayeli's steady eyes when she faced the deputies still burned clear. She hadn't cowered. She had stood firm, her voice cutting sharper than steel. He understood then she was no longer just a guest in his cabin. She was part of his life. At dawn, as the first light bled across the ridges, Ethan stepped onto the porch where Nayeli was shaking out a blanket. He didn't waste words. He placed the silver ring in his palm and held it out to her. I don't want papers. I don't want rumors or quarrels. I want marriage, if you'll have it. Her eyes widened. For a moment, the woman who had always met the world with guarded strength looked startled. Her hand trembled as she touched the ring. When her gaze met his, her dark eyes shone with something rare. I want, she whispered, her voice catching. Word was sent to Judge Franklin Hale, who agreed to perform the wedding beneath the old cottonwood by the creek, the same tree where many in the county had spoken their vows. Jonas McGraw and his wife offered gladly to stand as witnesses. The day of the wedding dawned bright and clear. The cottonwood stretched its branches like a great sheltering hand. Ethan wore a clean but weathered shirt. Nayeli donned the gray wool dress he had bought her, the new coat snug across her shoulders. The leather boots, still stiff, carried her steps steady. There were no flowers, no music, only the rush of water over stone and the song of birds in the branches. Judge Hale opened his ledger, voice worn with age but steady as ever. Ethan Cole, do you take Nayeli Greyhawk as your wife, to share life in winter and in spring, in peace and in storm? Ethan's head lifted. His voice rang with the weight of an oath sworn in battle. I do. His eyes never left hers. Hale turned to Nayeli, repeating the words slowly. She listened, lips tight, then spoke, her English halting but clear. I am his wife. He is my husband. When Ethan slid the silver ring onto her finger, her hand shook, but a smile broke across her face. Not the fleeting curve she'd shown before, but a true, unguarded smile, bright as sunlight after storm. Jonas clapped Ethan on the back, while his wife wrapped Nayeli in an embrace, whispering, "You're safe now. No one can touch you." For the first time, Ethan saw Nayeli rest her head in another woman's arms without stiffening. In that moment, he knew she had begun to believe she belonged to a home. The ceremony ended with no bells, no hymns, only the judge's firm closing of the ledger, the creek's steady murmur, and the sky wide open as witness. Yet that was enough. It was sacred in its simplicity. On the wagon ride back, sacks of flour and seed piled in the bed. Ethan sat beside her, his hand resting on the bench. Quietly. Nayeli slipped her fingers into his. He closed around them and didn't let go until they reached the cabin. That night, under a pale wash of moonlight, the cabin seemed different, no longer a shelter for a solitary man, no longer a refuge for a desperate woman. It had become theirs. The walls held not silence, but the soft sound of breath, the quiet echo of laughter, and the promise of a life unexpected yet full of happiness. From that night on, it was no longer my house or her shelter. It was their home. Summer came to Wyoming with long days and a hard blue sky. Across the land, beans and potatoes that Ethan and Nayeli had planted in the spring now grew tall and green, leaves trembling in the light breeze, promising a harvest more generous than he'd ever dared hope. For a man who had once lived only to get through another day, the sight of those rows meant more than food. It was proof of a life rebuilt. From the porch steps, Ethan watched Nayeli work among the rows, her dark hair falling loose as her hands moved steadily, pulling weeds, steady as the rhythm of the earth itself. And in his chest, he felt a kind of peace he thought he'd lost forever, the quiet of family. Inside the cabin, afternoons found Ethan bent over the cradle he was building. Pine boards, planed smooth, hammered together with care. Each strike of the mallet sounded like the beat of an eager heart. In the evenings, Nayeli sat near the fire, stitching a quilt scraps from the old torn dress she'd first worn to his door, mixed with bright new cloth from Cedar Bluff. The needle slid through fabric, pulling the past and the present into one piece, making something whole where once there had been only rags. One night, with the lamplight spilling gold across the table, Nayeli took Ethan's hand and pressed it against her belly. Her eyes glimmered like starlight. "In the spring," she whispered, "a child will come." Ethan froze, the rough palm of his hand resting on the slight curve that carried more promise than words could hold. His breath caught. For years he had lived with no thought of tomorrow, never daring to imagine more than another sunrise. Now the thought of a child, his child, filled his chest with a weight so great it turned into wonder. The news did not need spreading, yet it softened tongues in Cedar Bluff. The whispers had not vanished, but their edge dulled. The sight of a woman standing tall beside her husband, and the knowledge of a child on the way, quieted even the harshest gossips. A family is hard to argue against. Day by day, the cabin grew warmer with more than firelight. Ethan set the cradle by the window where morning sun would fall. Nayeli folded the finished quilt, running her fingers over the seams where old cloth met new. Those stitches were more than thread. They were testimony to her journey from hunger and fear to safety and hope. Evenings came gentle. After a meal of beans and cornbread, they sat on the porch, listening to the creek's murmur and the hum of insects in the grass. Ethan draped his arm around Nayeli's shoulders, and she leaned her head against him. Silence hung between them, but it was no longer the silence of loneliness. It was full of trust, of belonging, of peace. At times, Ethan asked himself how such a thing had come to be. A man once stripped of everything, resigned to solitude, now stood on the edge of a new life, and he knew the answer. It began the night he opened the door to a desperate stranger. That one choice to show mercy had changed the course of his life. Friends, perhaps you've known such crossroads yourselves, when a single decision, small in the moment, changed everything that followed. Ethan could have turned her away. But he did not. And in her courage to speak, to claim her freedom, Nayeli too found her place. Together, they built what neither had dared to dream of a home. And now, with a child promised in spring, their story carries beyond two souls. It is no longer only about survival, or even about love. It is proof that in the storms of prejudice and hardship, seeds of happiness can still take root and grow. I wonder what you think. Listening now, if you walked the streets of Cedar Bluff, wouldn't you tip your hat to them, offer blessing for the road ahead? Ethan and Nayeli deserve that, don't they? The strength of neighbors, the goodwill of strangers, the quiet cheer of those who believe in them, even from afar. What lies next? Perhaps Ethan will sow more land, make ready for the child. Perhaps Nayeli will piece together more quilts, each one a memory stitched into cloth. Or perhaps they will widen that little cabin into a true house, big enough for laughter and the cry of a newborn. Whatever the path, they no longer walk alone, and so their tale closes not with loss, but with a promise, the promise of new life, of a spring that will bring not just green shoots in the fields, but the voice of a child in their home. The most precious gift life can give to two people who once believed they had nothing left to hope for. So, my friends, as you've sat with me through their story, I ask you to carry them in your thoughts, support them in spirit. Let their journey remind us all happiness, though delayed, can still come. It waits for those willing to open their doors and their hearts.